Somewhere in America, right now, someone is looking at a number on a phone screen, a retirement balance. 60 million people do this. Check the account, watch it rise and fall, trust it with their old age. Here's what almost none of them know. The system holding that number is younger than most of the people using it. It did not exist before 1978. It was never planned, never debated, never designed. It began as a page and a half of tax code that nobody in Congress bothered to read, and it became the backbone of American retirement because one consultant, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, read those pages differently than the men who wrote them. And before that accident, before pensions, before Social Security, before any of it? For most of American history, the answer to what happens when you get old was brutal and simple. You worked until your body gave out. Then you leaned on your children, if you had them, and they could carry you. And if they couldn't, there was a building at the edge of town, and everyone knew its name, and everyone was terrified of it. So this is the story of how America learned to grow old. It runs through a song so grim it became a national hit, through a company that paid its loyal workers 15 cents on every dollar it owed them, through a chancellor in Germany who set the retirement age past the age most men died, and through the strangest accident in the history of money, the retirement plan nobody meant to invent. This is a story about savings, but underneath it's a question that never goes away. It only changes hands. When you can no longer work, whose problem are you? Let's open the vault. And it starts in a world where the word retirement barely existed. For nearly all of human history, there was no such thing as retiring. You worked until you physically couldn't. In 1900, life expectancy in the United States hovered around 47 years. Retirement planning wasn't a skill anyone needed, for the same reason nobody plans for a season most people never see. But there was a system, and it was old as agriculture itself, the family farm. Children weren't just children. They were the labor force and the pension fund in one. When a farmer's back gave out, his sons took the plow, and the old man stayed on the land he'd cleared, husking corn by the fire, minding grandchildren, dying in the house he built. It wasn't gentle, but it held. Then the factories came, and they tore that system apart with astonishing speed. In one generation, the young left the land for Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, 12-hour shifts, wages instead of harvests, a room in a boarding house instead of the family homestead. The parents stayed behind, and for the first time in American history, growing old meant growing old alone, which brings us to the building at the edge of town, the poorhouse. Every county had one. It was where you went when there was nothing left. No family, no savings, no strength to work. Old men and orphans, the sick and the mentally ill, all warehoused together, sleeping in rows, eating thin soup, wearing donated clothes. The residents were listed in the records not as patients or tenants. The word the ledgers used was inmates. And here's the detail that tells you what the country actually thought about aging. Through the 1800s, reformers pulled group after group out of the poorhouses. Children went to orphanages, the ill to asylums. One group stayed, the old. By the end of the century, the poorhouse had quietly become America's first retirement home. Nobody called it that. Everybody knew it. And the poorhouse wasn't even the worst arrangement on offer. In parts of rural New England, towns used an older method. They auctioned their poor. Once a year, the elderly and destitute of the town were put up before a crowd, and whoever agreed to house and feed them for the lowest payment from the town treasury won them. The record keepers called it venduing the poor. Think about the mechanics of that for a moment. The lowest bidder, by definition, was the person planning to spend the least on your food, your firewood, your care. Old age, sold at a discount to the most efficient neighbor. Communities that considered themselves God-fearing ran these auctions on the town green every spring for decades. Inside the poorhouses themselves, the routine was engineered to remind you what you were. Rise at dawn. Work the poor farm fields if your body allowed. The institution grew its own food to spare the taxpayers. Wear the institution's clothes. Ask permission to leave the grounds. In some states, you surrendered the right to vote when you entered, having signed what was called the pauper's oath, a legal declaration that you owned nothing and were owed nothing. A man could farm 60 years of Ohio soil, bury a wife, raise 6 children, and end his life legally reclassified from citizen to inmate. The fear of that building sank so deep into the American mind that it produced a hit song. In the 1870s, a poem called Over the Hill to the Poorhouse, an old widow, abandoned by the children she raised, walking her last mile to the almshouse, swept the country. It was recited on stages, printed in newspapers, sung in parlors. Think about what that means. The most popular tearjerker in America was about dying in institutional poverty, and it worked because every family in the audience could picture it happening to someone they loved. And the cruelest part was the shame. Ending up there wasn't treated as bad luck. It was treated as a verdict. You hadn't saved enough. You hadn't been enough. That shame was deliberate, built into the system to keep people terrified of dependency. But no amount of thrift protects a mill worker whose wages barely cover rent, whose body is spent at 50, and whose children are 3 states away living paycheck to paycheck themselves. That was the American retirement plan for a century. Work, hope, and dread. The first cracks in that bleak arrangement came not from the government, but from people organizing themselves. Fraternal lodges and religious societies, the Odd Fellows, the Masons, Irish benevolent associations, German mutual aid clubs, Jewish charitable funds, began building their own lifeboats. Pay dues while you're young and strong. The lodge shelters you when you're old. By the late 1800s, Brooklyn alone had dozens of homes for the aged run by churches and orders. In 1873, the Little Sisters of the Poor opened a home in Washington that took in the elderly regardless of faith or race. These places worked, but only for members. If you belonged to nothing, nothing belonged to you. Then, in 1875, came a genuinely new idea from a company you know for the wrong reason. American Express, then a freight and railroad services firm, not a credit card in sight, created the first corporate pension plan in the United States. Read the conditions, and you can feel how radical and how stingy it was. 20 years of service, age 60, a manager's recommendation, a committee's approval, the board's sign-off, and then half your salary, capped at $500 a year. A pension you had to be nominated for, like a prize. But the idea traveled. Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, AT&T, Kodak, General Electric. By the 1920s, the giants of American industry all had pension plans. It looked like the future. It's worth being honest about why the companies did it, because philanthropy was low on the list. The railroads, which built some of the biggest early pension systems, talked about their plans openly as tools of discipline. A pension you only received after 30 unbroken years of service was a leash made of your own future. Join a strike, lose your pension. Take a job with a rival, lose your pension. Age quietly, obey completely, and maybe at the end, the company would keep its word. Executives called it reducing labor turnover. The workers on the receiving end understood it more plainly. The company now owned not just your working years, but your old age too, and it could repossess it at any moment. Here's the fine print history books skim past. As late as 1932, only about 15% of American workers had access to any company pension at all. 85% had nothing, and even the lucky 15% were holding a promise written in smoke, because no law required a company to actually set money aside for its pension, and no law stopped a company from canceling the whole thing the day before you retired. A pension wasn't a contract, it was a mood, and there was one more invention worth pausing on, from across the ocean, because it shaped everything. In 1889, Germany's Otto von Bismarck created the world's first state pension system, payments for workers who reached old age. The retirement age he eventually settled on, 65, and at first, even 70. Average life expectancy at the time, around 45. Let that sink in. The world's first retirement age was set past the point most people died. The founding math of retirement, everywhere on Earth, was the same quiet bet. Promise dignity in old age, to a population that mostly won't collect it. Then came the decade that broke the bet, and everything else. The Great Depression didn't just destroy fortunes. It destroyed the story America told itself. that a careful man who worked hard and saved would be fine. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks failed, and the savings of a lifetime evaporated with them. It didn't matter that you'd been disciplined, the money was simply gone. Older workers were the first fired and the last rehired, and by 1934, roughly half of elderly Americans could no longer support themselves. The poorhouses, which had been slowly emptying, filled again, with people who had done everything right. And out of that ruin came one of the strangest political armies in American history. In 1933, a 66-year-old California doctor named Francis Townsend, himself broke and recently unemployed, wrote a letter to his local newspaper proposing something wild. The government should simply pay every American over the age of 60 a flat $200 a month on one condition. They had to spend all of it within 30 days to pump life back into the economy. The idea detonated. Within 2 years, there were thousands of Townsend clubs across the country and millions of members, elderly Americans, organized, angry, and voting. Washington considered the plan completely unworkable, and Washington was probably right. But politicians looked at those millions of organized old people and understood something with perfect clarity. The question of old age was no longer allowed to have no answer. That scale of ruin changed what was politically possible. And on August 14, 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act, the first permanent promise from the federal government that working Americans would not be discarded in old age. Payroll taxes in, monthly checks out for the rest of your life. The program was deliberately modest and shamefully incomplete. Farm workers, domestic servants, and the self-employed were left out, which in practice excluded most black workers and huge numbers of women. The average early benefit was about $22 a month. This was a floor, not a hammock. But I want you to meet the first person who ever stood on that floor, because her story is almost a parable. Ida Mae Fuller, a legal secretary from Ludlow, Vermont, retired in 1939 after paying into the brand new system for just 3 years, a grand total of about $24.75 in taxes. In January 1940, she received the very first monthly Social Security check in American history, $22.54. And then Ida Mae did something wonderful. She lived to be 100 years old. By the time she died in 1975, the woman who had paid in $25 had collected nearly $23,000. The system's first customer was also its first warning. This machine runs on the working young paying for the retired old, and it always will. And the floor kept rising, plank by plank. In 1939, benefits were extended to widows and orphans. The check would outlive the worker. In 1956, disability coverage was added. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed Medicare, closing the most terrifying gap of all, the medical bills of old age. Today, Social Security alone keeps more than 20 million Americans, most of them elderly, out of poverty. Whatever else this story says about broken promises, that one held. Roosevelt's planners never meant Social Security to carry retirement alone. They talked about a three-legged stool, Social Security for the floor, a company pension on top of it, and personal savings on top of that. 3 legs, so no single failure could drop you. For one golden generation, the stool actually stood. There's a wartime accident buried in this story too, and it explains more than any speech about corporate generosity. During the Second World War, Washington froze wages to fight inflation, but benefits didn't count as wages. So companies desperate for scarce workers competed with the only currency the law left them, pensions and health insurance. By the time the freeze lifted, the strange American habit of attaching your old age and your health care to your employer had hardened into the architecture of ordinary life. Most countries never did it this way. America did it because of a loophole in a wartime price control. In the boom years after the war, the pension went from perk to birthright. Unions were strong, labor was scarce, and in 1950, General Motors and the United Auto Workers struck a landmark bargain the press called the Treaty of Detroit: pensions, health benefits, and raises in exchange for labor peace. The rest of industrial America followed. By 1970, nearly half of all private sector workers were covered by a pension. This is the era that built the retirement picture we still carry in our heads. 30 years at the plant, the gold watch at the farewell party, the little lake cottage, the pension check and the Social Security check arriving together like clockwork until the end. For millions of factory workers, it was real. It felt eternal. If you want a single image of that era, take the gold watch. The ceremony was practically a liturgy. The shop floor gathered, the foreman gave a speech, the company presented a gold watch engraved with your name and your years, 25, 30, 35 of them, and everyone shook your hand, and you walked out of the gate for the last time, into a retirement the company would fund until you died. A watch was the perfect symbol, if you think about it. The firm had taken your time, all of it, and now it handed you back a little machine for counting the time you had left, and promised to pay for every hour of it. It rested on an honor system. And in December 1963, in South Bend, Indiana, the honor ran out. Studebaker was one of the oldest names in American manufacturing. 5 blacksmith brothers who built wheelbarrows for the gold rush, wagons for the Union Army, then automobiles admired for their design. But by the 60s, the company was losing its war with Detroit's Big Three, and behind the proud nameplate sat a secret. The pension fund was a shell. Studebaker had promised its workers generous retirements and simply never set aside the money to pay for them. When the South Bend plant closed and the pension plan was terminated, the arithmetic of betrayal came out. The retirees who'd already left, about 3,600 of them, got lucky. Their benefits were already locked in. But roughly 4,000 workers in their 40s and 50s, average age 52, average service 23 years, received about 15 cents for every dollar they had been promised. And 2,900 more, with under 10 years of service, got exactly nothing. Men who had spent their entire adult lives building cars walked out of the plant with a handshake and a settlement check worth a used refrigerator. Studebaker wasn't unique. Pension promises were quietly dying in textile mills and steel towns across the country. Studebaker was just the collapse big enough and public enough that America finally had to look at it. Even then, it took 11 years. 11 years of hearings, committee turf wars, union pressure, business lobbying, plus a Teamsters pension fraud scandal that put the words pension and crime in the same headlines. Finally, on Labor Day 1974, the date chosen deliberately, President Ford signed ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. Pensions now had to be funded, benefits had to vest, and a new federal insurance agency would stand behind pension promises the way deposit insurance stood behind bank accounts. With one honest asterisk, the new pension insurance had ceilings and limits, a guaranteed portion, not a guaranteed everything. Workers at failed companies would still lose part of what they'd been promised, but the difference between 15 cents on the dollar and most of your pension is the difference between ruin and a hard landing. On paper, no Studebaker could ever happen again, and here is where the story takes its strange turn, because ERISA, the law written to save the pension, helped kill it. All those new funding rules and standards made pensions dramatically more expensive and complicated to run. Small companies dropped their plans. Big companies started searching for something cheaper, some arrangement where the company's obligation would end early and the risk would live somewhere else. They found it in a place nobody was looking, subsection K. In 1978, Congress passed a sprawling tax overhaul and buried in it, under Section 401 of the Internal Revenue Code, subsection K, was a short technical provision about deferred compensation for executives, about a page and a half of text. It wasn't debated on the floor, it wasn't covered in the papers, it became law the way a leaf falls in a forest, and for 2 years it just sat there. Then, on a Saturday afternoon in the fall of 1979, a benefits consultant named Ted Benna sat in his office outside Philadelphia, paging through the tax code for a banking client, and stopped. He read subsection K again. The authors had meant it for executive bonus arrangements. But the words, read literally, didn't say that. Nothing in them stopped a company from letting every employee put part of their own paycheck in, pre-tax. Nothing stopped the company from matching it. The door wasn't open, but it wasn't locked either. Benna called his own interpretation aggressive, and he was right. His banking client rejected the idea, afraid the government would slam the door shut once it noticed. So Benna did it himself. installed the first 401k plan in America at his own small firm. Then he took the idea to Treasury officials, and in 1981, the regulators, instead of shutting the door, propped it wide open. What followed wasn't adoption. It was a stampede. Within a year, Johnson & Johnson, PepsiCo, and Honeywell were rolling out plans. The mutual fund industry looked at tens of millions of paychecks flowing into markets every 2 weeks and saw the greatest product launch in the history of finance. Wall Street built an entire industry on subsection K, and corporate America embraced it with a speed that should have made everyone suspicious. Because look at what the fine print actually traded away. A pension is a defined benefit. The company promises you a check for life, and if the market crashes, that's the company's problem. A 401k is a defined contribution. The company's duty ends the moment the match lands in your account. Market crashes at 64.5, your problem. Fees quietly eat a third of your returns over 40 years, your problem. Never taught how to invest? Also, somehow your problem. And hiding inside the fine print was a detail almost no one did the math on: fees. 1% a year in management fees sounds like nothing, a rounding error. Run it over a working lifetime and it behaves like a silent partner. A worker who saves steadily for 40 years and pays 1% annually hands roughly a quarter to a third of his final nest egg to the people managing it, not for taking the risk, which is his, but for holding the money while he does. Multiply that by tens of millions of accounts, and you understand why Wall Street didn't just accept the 401k. It celebrated it. The numbers tell you how fast the ground shifted. In 1975, private pensions had about 27 million active members. Today, that number has fallen by more than half, while 401k-style accounts exploded past 85 million. In a single generation, the risk of growing old moved off the corporate balance sheet and onto the kitchen table. There was no vote on this, no debate. It happened plan by plan, quietly, and it was sold, every step of it, as progress. There was one late confession built right into the law. By the 2000s, the data was undeniable. Left to enroll themselves, huge numbers of workers simply never signed up, not because they'd weighed the options, but because the form sat in a drawer. So in 2006, Congress blessed automatic enrollment. New hires would be placed into the plan by default, their money steered into prepackaged funds chosen for them unless they actively opted out. Read that as an admission. The system, built on the promise that every worker would become his own pension manager, had quietly concluded that most workers never would and started making the choices for them anyway. And the man who started it? Ted Benna, the father of the 401k, spent his later years saying openly that his invention had been hijacked, buried in fees, oversold as a pension replacement it was never designed to be. The creator of the modern American retirement system became one of its sharpest critics. His accident was never meant to carry 60 million people. Pull back and look at the whole arc, because it's really one question changing hands for 200 years. When you can no longer work, whose problem are you? For a century, the answer was your family's, and if not theirs, then a building at the edge of town with inmates in its ledger. Then, for one remarkable generation, the answer became your employers and your governments, the pension, the floor, the stool with 3 legs. And then quietly, through a page and a half of tax code, the answer changed again. You're your own problem now. Good luck in the markets. The results are in, and they rhyme with the beginning. Nearly half of Americans over 55 have no retirement savings at all. The median retirement account in this country holds a few $1,000s, months of expenses, not years. Millions will do exactly what their great-great-grandparents did. Work as long as the body allows, lean on family where there is family, and stretch a modest government check that was never meant to stand alone. And a new gap is opening that the whole system pretends not to see. The 401k assumes an employer, a company to run the plan, to send the match, to hand you the enrollment form. But an ever-growing slice of America doesn't have one. The freelancers, the contractors, the drivers and couriers assembling a living from apps. No employer, no plan, no match. For them, The retirement system isn't failing. It simply isn't there, which is, if you think about it, exactly where this story began. The poorhouse is gone. The fear that built it never left. It just changed costumes, from a grim building on the hill to a retirement calculator glowing on a phone at midnight, telling a 50-year-old in cold arithmetic what the old ballad told his ancestors in verse. So here's the question this whole story leaves us with, and I genuinely want to know where you stand. When a person grows old, who should carry that risk? The family, the employer, the government, or the individual alone? America has tried all four answers. Tell me in the comments which one you'd trust with your own old age. And the next time that retirement balance loads on your screen, remember what you're actually looking at. An accident from 1978, a page and a half of tax code, read sideways on a Saturday afternoon, holding up the old age of a nation. If stories like this are your kind of thing, the hidden machinery behind everything we take for granted, subscribe and open the vault with us. The archives go deeper than they look.